Nobody tells you what the middle feels like. They tell you about the beginning, the decision, the courage it takes to begin, the electricity of starting something. And they tell you about the end, the arrival, the reward. The moment you realize the long road was worth every difficult step. But the middle, the long, unglamorous, invisible middle, that is the part nobody prepares you for. That is the part that breaks most people. Not because they are weak, but because the middle looks exactly like failure, and most of us have never been taught to tell the difference. This is a story about the middle, about a man who lived there for years, and about the one thing that kept him moving when moving made no visible difference. Marcus was not remarkable in any of the ways the world uses that word. He was the middle child of a seamstress and a night shift security guard in a Rust Belt city where the steel mills had gone quiet before he was old enough to remember their noise. He grew up in a house where money was not discussed casually because it was not present casually, where every purchase involved a calculation that children were not supposed to notice but always did. His mother worked with her hands. Not in the romantic way that hands working with fabric is sometimes described, not with the ease of someone doing what they love, but with the focused, slightly desperate efficiency of someone who knows that the speed of her hands is directly connected to the stability of her household. She worked long hours and said little about it, and Marcus watched her doing both. His father slept during the day and guarded an office building at night. Marcus sometimes thought about his father standing in the lobby of some corporate tower at 3 inches the morning, watching the empty floors through the glass, guarding the assets of people who would never know his name. His father never complained about this. He simply did it, season after season, year after year, showing up. Marcus had inherited something from each of them. From his mother, the understanding that work is not always dignified but must be done regardless. From his father, the particular quiet that comes from doing difficult things without making a performance of the doing. He graduated high school with grades that were decent rather than exceptional, and a scholarship that covered approximately 1 semester of the education he needed. He enrolled anyway. This was the first decision that mattered, not because it was brave, though it required something adjacent to bravery, but because it was made in full knowledge of the gap between what he had and what he needed, and he chose to begin the journey anyway. The next 2 years were the kind of years that don't make good stories because they contain very little that can be compressed into memorable scenes. He worked double shifts on weekends. He took 18 credits at a time to make every dollar stretch as far as it would go before it ran out. He slept 4 hours a night and told himself, because he needed to believe it, that 4 hours was enough. It wasn't enough. Anyone could have told him it wasn't enough. But the mathematics of his situation didn't leave room for enough, so he worked with what he had. In the winter of his second year, something inside him quietly broke, not dramatically, not with the sudden collapse that makes for good storytelling. The way old wood breaks under slow, sustained pressure, not a crack, but a gradual giving, a loss of integrity that happens over weeks before it becomes visible. He started missing classes on the days when missing them felt like the only alternative to sitting in a room and being unable to absorb a single word. He withdrew from 2 courses, then 3. He told himself it was temporary, that he was managing something, that next semester would be different. By spring, he was gone. He left with a duffel bag and a silence he couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't felt it themselves, the specific silence of someone who tried hard at the right things and still ended up somewhere they did not intend to be. He was 20 years old, and he felt the particular shame of someone who has publicly committed to a direction and then been seen walking away from it. The 3 years that followed were not a montage. This matters and deserves to be said clearly. There was no training sequence set to swelling music. There was no series of quick cuts showing effort accumulating toward an inevitable victory. There were Tuesday mornings when getting dressed felt like a negotiation between the part of him that knew he had to and the part of him that had run out of reasons why it mattered. There were job applications that disappeared into silence. Not rejections. Rejections would have been something, would have confirmed that his application had at least been received by a human being. Just silence. The particular silence of systems that receive thousands of attempts and have no mechanism for acknowledging the ones they choose not to pursue. There were nights, many nights, spread across many months when he did the calculation, the one that every person who has fallen behind their peers eventually does in the small hours of the morning when the defenses are down. He would count the people he had grown up alongside and figure out where they were and where he was and how far the distance between those two positions had grown since the last time he checked. The calculation never made him feel better. He kept doing it anyway, the way people keep pressing a bruise not because it helps, but because something in the pressing is at least a form of acknowledgement. He worked at a print shop. He was good at it in the way that competent, unhappy people are good at things reliably, efficiently, without the extra dimension that comes from doing something you believe in. He learned the rhythms of the machines. He learned which papers fed cleanly and which jammed at the same point every time. He showed up every day and did the work and went home. And in the evenings, he opened his laptop and taught himself to code. Not because he had a plan, not because he could see clearly where the coding would lead, but because it was something he could control, something that responded to effort with visible results, something that did not require anyone else's permission or approval. He would work at it until his eyes refused to cooperate, and then he would fall asleep at the keyboard and wake up with indentations on his face from the keys and start again. 17 applications for a junior developer role. 17. Not a few, not a handful. 17 individual attempts, each one requiring him to believe again that this time might be different, to suppress the memory of the previous silence, to reconstruct enough hope to try once more. He got an interview on the 18th attempt. He sat across from two people in a small office and answered their questions with the careful precision of someone who had taught himself entirely from free resources and had no institutional credentials to lean on, only the actual knowledge he had accumulated through years of quiet, self-directed effort. He answered correctly. He got the job at a company he had never heard of, for a salary that was modest rather than comfortable, in a position that was not the arrival he had imagined when he first sat down at his mother's kitchen table and decided he was going to build something. He took it, without hesitation, without glamour. He kept an index card above his monitor. Not a quote from a successful person, not a vision board or a goal written in capital letters or an affirmation that prosperity was coming. Just 7 words, written in his own handwriting, in blue pen, on a card that was already starting to curl at the corners by the time he pinned it up. Show up again. That was the whole philosophy. Not believe in yourself. He had discovered that belief is not a faucet you can turn on through willpower, but a thing that comes and goes based on evidence. Not greatness is within you. He had met enough people for whom no amount of greatness had been sufficient to overcome the structural disadvantages they were born into. Not any of the large, confident promises that motivational content makes to people who are suffering. Just show up again. Because the day you don't show up is the only day that guarantees nothing happens. He had arrived at this not through reading or inspiration, but through the long, practical experience of showing up on days when he didn't believe it would make any difference, and discovering again and again that it made a small difference. Not a transforming difference, not a montage-worthy difference, just a small one. And small differences, accumulated over years, eventually become something that can be called a direction. He spent 2 years at that first company learning everything they would teach him. Not just the technical things, the architecture, the languages, the debugging and the deployment, but the other things. How organizations move, where decisions actually get made versus where they appear to get made. How to talk about technical problems in language that non-technical people can act on. How to be reliable in a way that makes other people's work easier, which is a more useful skill than almost anything that gets taught in school. Then he moved. Then he built. Slowly, without announcement, without the kind of press that attaches to people whose success is faster and louder than his was. At 31, Marcus co-founded a software firm. It helped small manufacturers exactly the kind of operations that had once employed his father's colleagues, the businesses that had gone quiet and left behind the economic landscape he had grown up inside digitize their operations. Take the knowledge that existed in their workers' heads and their paper records and make it something that could survive the departure of any individual person. Make it something that could scale, that could adapt, that could continue. The firm was not a unicorn. No one wrote profiles of it in publications that profile unicorns. It did not grow so fast that its growth became a story unto itself. It was not a disruption or a revolution or a paradigm shift. It employed 41 people. It paid them well, not extravagantly, but well enough that they could make decisions about their lives from a position of stability rather than desperation. It stayed profitable through 3 economic downturns, because Marcus had learned in that long middle how to make do with less and still deliver more, how to build systems that work when the conditions are difficult, because he had spent years building himself under exactly those conditions. Success did not feel like victory. This is the thing that surprised him most. He had assumed the way most people assume, because the stories we tell about success are almost always stories about the feeling of arrival, that when enough had accumulated, when enough had become enough, there would be a moment of recognition, a feeling of completion, something that distinguished the Wednesday he had succeeded from the Wednesday before it. There was no such Wednesday. There was just a day when he was sitting at his desk, not the kitchen table of his childhood, not the monitor with the index card, just a desk in an office that employed 41 people. And he realized, with quiet astonishment, that he had stopped calculating how far behind he was. That the calculation had simply ceased, not because he had won some competition, but because the competition had become irrelevant, because he had been so busy showing up that he had forgotten to keep score. Again had finally become enough. Marcus's story is not exceptional because he overcame extraordinary obstacles. This is the part that matters most and gets said least. His obstacles were ordinary. The broken semester was ordinary. Millions of people leave school every year for the same reasons he did. The silence of 17 job applications was ordinary. The nights of careful, despairing calculation were ordinary. The index card above the monitor was ordinary. The small company that helped small businesses was ordinary. What was not ordinary was the decision made again and again, on mornings that gave him no particular reason, to make it to show up one more time. Not forever. Not with certainty about the outcome. Just one more time. And then, when one more time was complete, one more time again. If you are in the middle right now, if the finish line is invisible and the starting line feels embarrassingly recent, if you are doing Tuesday mornings and silent applications and calculations, you cannot stop running, then this story is not here to promise you anything. It cannot promise that showing up will lead to the outcome you want. It cannot tell you that your specific middle will resolve into the specific end you are working toward. The world is not constructed to reward effort with proportional results. Many people show up for years and do not get what they came for. That is true, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What it can tell you is smaller and more durable than a promise. The people who finish are almost never the ones who never fell. They are not the ones who found the path easy or the conditions favorable or the middle mercifully short. They are the ones who fell, rested, and then stood up one more time than they sat down. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. You don't need motivation. You don't need to feel ready. You don't need the conditions to improve or the calculation to come out differently or someone to tell you that this time will be the time. You just need to show up again. One more time. That's the card above the monitor. That's the whole philosophy.